The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Buckingham Palace as Princess and strode purposefully through the corridors, her boots clicking against the polished marble floors. At 73, the Princess Royal had never been one to mince words or shy away from confrontation, and today would prove no different. The weight of the sealed envelope in her hand seemed to grow heavier with each step toward the king's private study. Charles had been king for just over 2 years, but the transition had been far from smooth. The public mourned Queen Elizabeth II deeply, and many questioned whether her eldest son possessed the same unwavering dedication to duty that had defined her 70-year reign, and knew better than anyone that her brother carried the burden of comparison heavily, often retreating into his environmental causes and architectural interests when the pressure of kingship became overwhelming. The palace staff had grown accustomed to the tension that seemed to permeate every royal gathering since the coronation. What they hadn't anticipated was the bombshell that Princess Anne was about to drop, one that would shake the very foundations of the modern monarchy and expose the deep fractures that had been carefully hidden from public view. And paused outside the heavy oak door, her hand resting on the brass handle. Inside, she could hear the familiar sound of her brother's voice, measured and thoughtful as he conducted what sounded like a conference call with government officials. The conversation seemed to center around upcoming state visits and the king's role in strengthening Commonwealth ties, topics that had become increasingly important as the monarchy sought to maintain relevance in a rapidly changing world. The document in Anne's possession contained evidence that would force Charles to make the most difficult decision of his reign. For months, she had been quietly investigating irregularities in the royal household's financial management, following a trail that led directly to the Queen Consort's private office. What she had discovered was a systematic pattern of misuse of royal funds, charity money being diverted for personal expenses, and, worst of all, attempts to silence palace staff who had raised concerns about these practices. Camilla's transformation from the other woman to Queen Consort had been carefully orchestrated over decades, and had never fully trusted her sister-in-law's motives. While the public had gradually accepted Camilla, particularly after her dedication during the late Queen's final years, and had observed troubling signs that suggested the acceptance had gone to Camilla's head, the Princess Royal had always prided herself on her direct approach to problems. Unlike other members of the royal family who preferred to work behind the scenes or through intermediaries and believed in confronting issues head-on, this approach had served her well throughout her decades of royal service, earning her respect even from those who found her manner somewhat intimidating. As she finally turned the handle and entered the study, Charles looked up from his desk with surprise. The king's private study reflected his personality perfectly, filled with architectural books, environmental reports, and correspondence from various charitable organizations. Watercolor paintings of his beloved Highgrove estate adorned the walls, providing a sense of tranquility that would soon be shattered. "And I wasn't expecting you," Charles said, gesturing for her to take a seat in one of the leather armchairs positioned near the fireplace. "Is everything all right? You look rather serious, even by your standards," and remained standing, her military bearing evident in her posture. Years of royal engagements, equestrian competitions, and official duties had given her an aura of authority that commanded attention. "This concerns Camilla," and continued, placing the envelope on the mahogany desk between them. "And I'm afraid the situation is more serious than you might imagine." Charles felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. His relationship with Camilla had weathered countless storms over the years, from the public scandal of their affair during his marriage to Diana to the gradual acceptance that had culminated in their wedding and her eventual recognition as Queen Consort. He had hoped that phase of their lives was behind them, that they could focus on their royal duties without the constant scrutiny and controversy that had marked their earlier years together. "What kind of situation?" Charles asked, though something in his sister's expression suggested he might not want to hear the answer, and opened the envelope and spread several documents across the desk. Bank statements, charity records, expense reports, and what appeared to be email correspondence formed a damning collection of evidence. For the past 6 months, I've been investigating concerns raised by several members of the household staff. What started as questions about unusual expense claims has uncovered something much more troubling. The king leaned forward, scanning the documents with growing alarm. The papers detailed a complex web of financial irregularities centered around Camilla's official activities. Charity funds intended for causes close to the queen consort's heart had been redirected to cover personal expenses, including extensive renovations to her private apartments, designer clothing purchases, and even family holidays that had been disguised as official engagements. My God, and where did you get these? Charles asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sources within the household who were brave enough to come forward, despite being threatened with dismissal if they spoke out, and replied grimly. Charles, this isn't just about money. It's about abuse of power, intimidation of staff, and a complete disregard for the principles that our family is supposed to represent. The implications began to sink in as Charles continued reading. Each document painted a picture of systematic deception, with Camilla apparently believing that her position as queen consort placed her above the scrutiny that applied to other members of the royal family. The amounts involved weren't necessarily huge by royal standards, but the breach of trust was enormous. One particularly damaging email chain showed Camilla's private secretary discussing how to handle staff members who had raised concerns about the financial irregularities. The tone was threatening, suggesting that anyone who spoke out would find their employment terminated and their reputations destroyed. For an institution that prided itself on treating its employees fairly, such behavior was completely unacceptable. There's more, and said quietly, producing another set of documents. She's been using her position to pressure charitable organizations into making donations to causes that directly benefit her friends and family members. Some of these charities have been struggling financially, yet they felt they had no choice but to comply with requests from the Queen Consort's office. Charles sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of kingship more heavily than ever before. The monarchy had survived countless scandals over the centuries, but in the modern era of instant communication and social media, even minor infractions could become major crises. What and had uncovered wasn't minor. The king's mind raced through the possible consequences if this information became public. The Republican movement, which had gained some momentum following his accession, would seize upon such revelations as evidence that the monarchy was corrupt and outdated. The carefully cultivated image of a modernizing, accountable royal family would be shattered overnight. How many people know about this? Charles asked, already dreading the answer. At the moment, just the staff members who came forward, myself, and now you, and replied. But, Charles, this cannot remain hidden. The people who brought this to my attention did, so at considerable personal risk. They deserve to see justice done, and the institution deserves to be protected from further damage. The siblings sat in silence for several minutes, the magnitude of the situation settling over them like a heavy blanket. Outside, the sounds of London traffic provided a constant reminder of the world beyond the palace walls, a world that would be watching closely to see how the royal family handled this crisis. Charles had always known that marrying Camilla would bring challenges, but he had hoped that her gradual acceptance by the public and her dedication to royal duties would prove that their love story had a happy ending. Now he was faced with evidence that suggested his wife had been systematically abusing the trust placed in her, betraying not just him personally, but the institution they both served. What do you think I should do? Charles asked finally, though he suspected he already knew Anne's answer. You need to confront her, Anne said firmly. Give her the opportunity to explain herself, though I'm not sure what explanation could justify this behavior. But, Charles, you also need to understand that this goes beyond personal relationships. You're the king now. Your first duty is to the crown and to the people. The weight of those words hung in the air between them. Charles had spent his entire life preparing for the throne, but nothing could have prepared him for a moment like this. He was being asked to choose between his wife and his duty, between personal loyalty and institutional integrity. As Anne gathered up the documents, She looked at her brother with a mixture of sympathy and determination. I know this is impossibly difficult, Charles, but remember what our mother always said about duty coming first. The monarchy will survive this, but only if we handle it with complete transparency and accountability. After and left, Charles remained in his study for hours, staring out at the gardens where he had played as a child. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier, and he knew that the decisions he made in the coming days would define not just his reign, but the future of the monarchy itself. The evening light was fading when Charles finally summoned the courage to call for Camilla. Their confrontation would have to wait until morning, but he knew that when it came, it would change everything. The king who had waited so long for his throne was about to face the greatest test of his reign, one that would require him to choose between his heart and his crown. As he prepared for what would undoubtedly be a sleepless night, Charles couldn't help but think about his mother's words during one of their last conversations. The crown must always come first, Charles, she had said. Personal happiness is important, but duty to the realm is everything. Tomorrow, he would discover just how much he was willing to sacrifice in service to that principle. The palace slept uneasily that night, as if the very walls sensed the storm that was about to break. In her own chambers and reviewed the evidence one more time, knowing that she had done the right thing, but understanding the pain it would cause her brother. The path of duty was never easy, but it was the only path available to those who wore the crown or served those who did. Meanwhile, unaware of the gathering storm, Camilla made her final preparations for what she believed would be just another day of royal engagements, not knowing that her world was about to change forever. The morning arrived gray and overcast, matching Charles's mood as he prepared for what would undoubtedly be one of the most difficult conversations of his life. He had barely slept, spending most of the night reviewing evidence and trying to reconcile the woman he loved with the behavior documented in those damning papers. By dawn, he had reached a painful conclusion. There was no way to explain away what Camilla had done. Camilla entered the breakfast room with her usual cheerful demeanor, completely unaware of the storm clouds gathering around her. At 76, she had grown comfortable in her role as queen consort, finally feeling secure in a position that had taken decades to achieve. Her morning routine had become pleasantly predictable, reviewing the day's schedule with her private secretary, discussing charitable engagements, and enjoying quiet moments with Charles before the demands of royal life took over. "Good morning, darling," she said, kissing Charles on the cheek as she took her usual seat. "I see you're up early again. Still worried about the Commonwealth Summit preparations?" Charles looked up from his untouched breakfast, his eyes showing the strain of his sleepless night. For a moment, he almost lost his resolve. This was the woman who had stood by him through decades of public scrutiny, who had helped him find happiness after the trauma of his failed marriage to Diana. But the documents spread across his desk upstairs told a different story, one that couldn't be ignored. "Camilla, we need to talk," he said quietly, his formal tone immediately alerting her that something was seriously wrong. "Of course," she replied, though her smile faltered slightly. "What's troubling you?" Charles reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folder containing copies of the most damaging evidence. As he placed it on the table between them, Camilla's face went pale. Even before opening it, she seemed to understand what it might contain. "And came to see me yesterday," Charles began, his voice steady but strained. "She brought some very serious concerns about your office's handling of charitable funds and household expenses. I need you to help me understand what's been happening." Camilla's hands trembled slightly as she opened the folder and began scanning the documents. Charles watched her face carefully, looking for any sign of genuine surprise or confusion that might suggest she had been unaware of what was being done in her name. Instead, he saw recognition and, gradually, defiance. "I can explain all of this," she said finally, though her voice lacked conviction. "There have been some misunderstandings about how certain expenses were categorized, but nothing improper has occurred." "Misunderstandings?" Charles's voice rose slightly before he caught himself and lowered it again. "Camilla, These documents show a pattern of deliberate deception spanning months. Charity funds diverted for personal use, staff threatened with dismissal for raising concerns, pressure applied to charitable organizations for personal benefit. How do you explain that as a misunderstanding? The Queen Consort set the papers down and looked directly at her husband, her expression hardening. Charles, I've given everything to this institution. I've endured decades of public hatred, constant comparison to your first wife, and endless scrutiny of my every action. I think I'm entitled to some compensation for that sacrifice. The audacity of her response left Charles momentarily speechless. He had expected denials, perhaps even genuine remorse, but not this sense of entitlement that seemed to justify any behavior. You're entitled to the respect and support that comes with your position, Charles said carefully. But that position also comes with responsibilities and expectations. You cannot use charitable funds as your personal bank account, and you certainly cannot threaten staff members who are simply doing their jobs. Camilla stood up abruptly, her calm facade finally cracking. Don't lecture me about responsibility, Charles. I've spent years rebuilding your reputation after Diana, helping you become a king the people could accept. I've earned a right to enjoy some of the privileges that come with being queen consort. By stealing from charities? Charles shot back, his own composure beginning to slip. By intimidating employees? Camilla, these aren't privileges, they're crimes. The word hung in the air between them like a physical presence. For the first time since the conversation began, Camilla seemed to grasp the seriousness of her situation. The color drained from her face as she slowly sat back down. Crimes? She whispered. Charles, you can't be serious. I'm the queen consort. I'm your wife. And that makes this even worse, Charles replied, his voice heavy with sadness. You've not only damaged the monarchy's reputation, you've put me in an impossible position. As king, I have a duty to uphold the law and maintain the integrity of the crown. As your husband, I want to protect you, but I can't do both. Over the next hour, Charles methodically went through each piece of evidence with Camilla, giving her every opportunity to provide explanations or context that might mitigate the damage. Instead, her responses only made things worse. She admitted to authorizing the financial transfers, claimed the staff complaints were exaggerated, and maintained that her position entitled her to certain considerations that others might not understand. What disturbed Charles most was not just what she had done, but how she justified it. There was no remorse, no acknowledgement that her actions had been wrong. Instead, she seemed genuinely surprised that anyone would question her right to use royal resources for personal benefit. I need you to understand something, Camilla, Charles said finally. This information will not remain secret, and has sources within the household who risked their careers to bring this to light. They deserve justice, and the institution deserves to be protected from further damage. What are you saying? Camilla asked, though her expression suggested she already knew. I'm saying that we have a choice to make. We can get ahead of this story, take responsibility, and try to minimize the damage to the monarchy. Or we can wait for it to become public and face the consequences of appearing to cover it up. Camilla's response was immediate and fierce. You're not seriously considering throwing me under the bus to save your precious institution, are you? After everything I've done for you, for this family? This isn't about throwing you under the bus, Charles replied wearily. This is about doing what's right. The monarchy has to be above reproach, Camilla. It's the only way we maintain the public's trust. The public's trust? She laughed bitterly. The same public that called me a homewrecker for years? The same public that still thinks Diana was a saint, and I'm a villain? You're worried about their trust? Charles felt a surge of anger at her dismissive tone. Yes, I am worried about their trust. Because without it, we have nothing. The monarchy exists only because the people allow it to exist. If we lose their respect, we lose everything our family has worked to build for generations. The conversation continued for another hour, but it became increasingly clear that they were at an impasse. Camilla maintained that her actions were justified and that any scandal would blow over, as royal scandals always did. Charles knew that in the modern era, with social media and 24-hour news cycles, such scandals could destroy the monarchy completely. As they sat in tense silence, Charles's private secretary knocked and entered with the morning schedule. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that Camilla's first engagement was a visit to a children's charity, one of the very organizations that had suffered from her financial manipulations. "Sir, the Queen Consort's car will be ready in 30 minutes for the charity visit," the secretary announced, clearly unaware of the conversation that had been taking place. "Cancel it," Charles said quietly. "Sir, cancel all of the Queen Consort's engagements for today, and arrange for a meeting with the Prime Minister this afternoon. There are matters of state that require immediate attention." The secretary looked confused, but nodded and left. Camilla stared at her husband with growing alarm. "You can't be serious, Charles. You can't just cancel my engagements. People are expecting me. Those people deserve better than to be used as props while this situation remains unresolved," Charles replied. "Until we determine how to move forward, I think it's best if you maintain a low profile." The full implications of Charles's words began to sink in. Camilla realized that her husband wasn't just angry about her financial irregularities. He was preparing to take action that could fundamentally change her position within the royal family. "What exactly are you planning to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Charles looked at his wife with a mixture of sadness and resolve. "I'm going to do what my mother would have done. I'm going to put the crown first." The weight of those words settled over both of them. Throughout their long relationship, Charles had often struggled to balance his personal desires with his royal duties. The public had watched this struggle play out during his marriage to Diana, his relationship with Camilla, and his eventual path to the throne. Now, for perhaps the first time in his life, his duty was crystal clear. "I love you, Camilla," Charles continued, his voice breaking slightly. "But I cannot allow personal feelings to compromise the integrity of the crown. Our mother spent 70 years building trust with the British people. I will not allow that legacy to be destroyed on my watch." Camilla stood up slowly, her face a mask of controlled fury. "If you do this, Charles, if you sacrifice me for your precious monarchy, don't expect me to go quietly. I have my own reputation to protect, my own legacy to consider." "I understand," Charles replied sadly, "but I hope you'll also understand that I have no choice. The evidence is too damning, and the risks to the institution are too great." As Camilla left the room, Charles remained seated at the breakfast table, staring out at the garden where he had once found such peace. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier, but for the first time since his accession, he felt certain he was making the right decision. The morning's confrontation had clarified something that Charles had been struggling with throughout his reign. Being king meant making impossible choices, but it also meant having the courage to make them when the time came. As he prepared for his meeting with the Prime Minister, he knew that the most difficult part of this crisis was yet to come. In her private apartments, Camilla began making phone calls of her own, reaching out to journalists and advisors who had supported her over the years. If Charles was prepared to sacrifice her for the crown, she would ensure that her side of the story was heard. The battle for the future of the monarchy was about to become very public indeed. The Prime Minister arrived at Buckingham Palace that afternoon with a sense of foreboding. The urgent summons from King Charles had been unexpected, and the lack of specific details about the meeting's purpose suggested something significant was developing. As one of the few people who understood the delicate balance between the monarchy and modern democratic government, she knew that royal crises could quickly become constitutional ones. Charles received her in his private study, the same room where and had delivered her bombshell evidence just 24 hours earlier. The king looked as though he had aged years in a single day, the weight of his impossible situation evident in every line of his face. "Thank you for coming so quickly," Charles began, gesturing for her to take a seat. "I'm afraid we have a situation that requires your immediate attention and discretion." Over the next hour, Charles laid out the full scope of Camilla's financial irregularities, sharing in evidence, and explaining the confrontation that had taken place that morning. The Prime Minister listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious with each revelation. "Your Majesty," she said finally, This is indeed a very serious matter. The implications go far beyond the royal family. If this becomes public without proper handling, it could destabilize public confidence in all our institutions. Charles nodded grimly. That's exactly what I'm afraid of. But I also cannot ignore what has happened or attempt to cover it up. The monarchy's credibility depends on our willingness to hold ourselves to the highest standards. The Prime Minister appreciated the king's position, but she also understood the political ramifications. What exactly are you proposing to do? Charles had spent the entire day wrestling with this question, consulting constitutional experts and reviewing historical precedents. What he was contemplating had never been done before in the modern era, but the circumstances were unprecedented. I believe the Queen Consort must step back from all official duties while a full investigation takes place, Charles said slowly. If the investigation confirms what we already know, then more drastic action may be necessary. More drastic action? The Prime Minister asked, though she suspected she knew what he meant. The possibility of divorce, Charles said quietly. Not because I don't love my wife, but because the integrity of the crown must come first. The political implications of such a move were staggering. A royal divorce was always problematic, but divorcing a queen consort over financial impropriety would send shockwaves through the entire establishment. Yet the Prime Minister could see Charles's dilemma clearly. Maintaining Camilla in her position after such revelations would be even more damaging. Your Majesty, I need to be very direct with you, the Prime Minister said. If you proceed with this course of action, you'll need to be prepared for an extremely hostile response from certain quarters. The Queen Consort has supporters in the media and among the public who will not take kindly to what they'll see as her being scapegoated. As if to prove her point, Charles's private secretary knocked and entered with obvious urgency. Sir, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's been a development. Several media outlets have received calls from representatives of the Queen Consort, and it appears some information may be about to become public. Charles felt his heart sink. In his confrontation with Camilla that morning, he had hoped they might be able to handle the situation privately and with dignity. Instead, it appeared she was preparing for a public battle. What kind of information? The Prime Minister asked. Details about financial arrangements within the royal household, suggestions that the Queen Consort is being unfairly targeted, and claims that certain family members have orchestrated a campaign against her, the secretary replied carefully. Charles closed his eyes briefly, imagining the headlines that would soon follow. Camilla was clearly attempting to frame herself as a victim of palace intrigue, rather than acknowledging her own wrongdoing. The strategy might generate some public sympathy, but it would also ensure that the full scope of her financial impropriety would eventually come to light. How long do we have before this becomes public? Charles asked. Hours, perhaps less, the secretary replied. The palace press office is fielding calls from major newspapers and television networks. The Prime Minister stood up, her mind already racing through the political calculations. Your Majesty, if this story is about to break, we need to get ahead of it immediately. The worst possible outcome would be for you to appear reactive rather than decisive. Charles knew she was right, but the speed with which events were unfolding left him feeling overwhelmed. Just 48 hours earlier, his biggest concern had been an upcoming state visit. Now he was facing the complete collapse of his marriage and a constitutional crisis that could define his entire reign. What do you recommend? He asked. A preemptive statement, the Prime Minister replied without hesitation. Acknowledge that irregularities have been discovered, confirm that an investigation is underway, and announce that the Queen Consort is stepping back from official duties pending its completion. Control the narrative before it controls you. As they worked on drafting the statement, news arrived that made their task even more urgent. Camilla had given an interview to a sympathetic journalist, portions of which were already being leaked on social media. In the interview, she portrayed herself as a devoted wife and royal servant who was being punished for minor administrative errors by family members who had never accepted her. She's claiming this is all Anne's doing, Charles's communications director reported grimly. She's suggesting that the Princess Royal has been conducting a vendetta against her and manipulating you into taking action. Charles felt a surge of anger at this characterization of his sister, and had acted with complete integrity, bringing legitimate concerns to his attention despite knowing the personal cost to him. To see her painted as a scheming manipulator was almost worse than the original financial scandal. "That's completely false," Charles said firmly, "and acted properly and courageously. She will not be thrown under the bus to protect someone who has clearly abused their position." The interview also contained veiled threats about what other information Camilla might reveal if she fell cornered. References to private conversations with Charles about other family members, suggestions that she knew where other bodies were buried, and hints about the true dynamics within the royal marriage painted a picture of someone prepared to inflict maximum damage rather than accept responsibility. "Sir," the communications director continued, "we need to issue our statement within the next hour if we're going to have any control over this story." Charles looked at the draft statement one more time. It was carefully worded, factual, and dignified, but he knew it would effectively end his marriage. Once the palace confirmed that Camilla had been suspended from royal duties due to financial irregularities, there would be no going back. "Do it," he said quietly. Within minutes, the statement was released across all royal communication channels. The palace confirmed that irregularities in the management of charitable funds and household expenses had been discovered in connection with the Queen Consort's office. The statement announced that a full investigation would be conducted and that the Queen Consort would temporarily step back from all official duties to allow the investigation to proceed without any appearance of impropriety. The response was immediate and explosive. Social media erupted with competing hashtags, traditional media scrambled to get royal experts on air, and politicians from all parties were forced to comment on a situation none of them had anticipated. The most surprising response came from the public themselves. Polling conducted within hours of the announcement showed that a majority of Britons supported the king's decision to prioritize institutional integrity over personal loyalty. Many commented that they respected Charles more for taking difficult action than they would have if he had attempted to protect his wife. However, Camilla's supporters were not quiet. Several prominent journalists who had championed her transformation from royal mistress to respected Queen Consort published articles questioning whether she was being treated fairly. They pointed to her years of service, her gradual acceptance by the public, and her support for Charles during his transition to the throne. By evening, the story had become international news. CNN, BBC World Service, and other global networks led their bulletins with the royal crisis. Constitutional experts were analyzing the precedents. Republican movements were claiming vindication, and monarchist organizations were trying to present the situation as evidence of the royal family's commitment to accountability. In her private apartments, Camilla watched the coverage with growing alarm. What she had intended as a preemptive strike to protect her position had instead accelerated her downfall. The palace statement, combined with the leaked details of her interview, had created a narrative in which she appeared both guilty of financial impropriety and unwilling to accept responsibility. Late that night, and arrived at the king's study unannounced. She had spent the day fielding calls from other royal family members, all of whom were trying to understand how the situation had deteriorated so quickly. "How are you holding up?" she asked her brother, noting the exhaustion in his eyes. "I keep thinking this must be a nightmare that I'll wake up from," Charles replied wearily. "This morning I was married to the Queen Consort. Tonight I'm facing the possibility of divorce proceedings and a constitutional crisis," and sat down across from him, her expression sympathetic but determined. "You did the right thing, Charles. Mother always said that the crown must come first, and you honor that principle today. But at what cost?" Charles asked. "I've destroyed my marriage, created a media circus, and probably damaged the monarchy's reputation for years to come." "The monarchy's reputation would have been far more damaged if you had tried to cover this up," and replied firmly. "The public respects courage and integrity. They understand that you made an incredibly difficult decision based on principle rather than personal convenience." As if to underscore her point, Charles's private secretary appeared with the first overnight polling results. Despite the chaos of the day, the king's approval ratings had actually increased. The British public, it seemed, valued moral leadership over royal drama. "There's something else," and said quietly. "I've been approached by representatives of several charities that were affected by Camilla's actions. They want to know if there's any possibility of recovering the misused funds." Charles hadn't even considered this aspect of the crisis. The financial damage to charitable organizations added another layer of moral complexity to the situation. These were groups that depended on public donations to help vulnerable people, and Camilla's actions had directly harmed their ability to fulfill their missions. "We'll make sure every penny is returned," Charles said without hesitation. "Whatever personal funds are necessary, whatever restructuring of royal finances is required, those organizations will be made whole." As the siblings talked through the practical implications of the crisis, both understood that they were witnessing a fundamental transformation of the monarchy. Charles's decision to prioritize institutional integrity over personal loyalty would define not just his reign, but the royal family's relationship with the British people for generations to come. Outside the palace walls, the media circus continued unabated. Television crews from around the world had set up camp outside Buckingham Palace. Royal correspondents were working around the clock to develop new angles on the story, and social media was generating theories and commentary faster than anyone could follow. But inside the king's study, Charles and were focused on the future rather than the immediate chaos. They both understood that this crisis, as painful as it was personally, represented an opportunity to demonstrate that the modern monarchy was willing to hold itself to the highest standards of accountability and transparency. As the clock approached midnight, Charles made one final decision that would cement his transformation from a king who had struggled with the balance between duty and personal desire into a monarch who placed the crown above all other considerations. Tomorrow, he would instruct his lawyers to begin divorce proceedings against the Queen Consort 3 weeks after the initial revelation. The full scope of Camilla's financial misconduct had been laid bare through a comprehensive independent investigation. The final report, delivered to King Charles on a cold January morning, painted an even more damning picture than Anne's original evidence had suggested. The systematic misuse of charitable funds totaled nearly £2 million, and the investigation had uncovered additional instances of abuse of power that went far beyond financial irregularities. Charles sat alone in his study, reading through the report one final time before making the announcement that would forever change the British monarchy. The evidence was overwhelming and indisputable. Camilla had not only diverted charitable funds for personal use, but had also pressured suppliers to provide services at below-market rates with the implicit threat of losing royal patronage, manipulated charity auction outcomes to benefit her friends, and maintained a culture of fear among palace staff that prevented proper oversight. The 3 weeks since the story broke had been among the most difficult of Charles's life. Camilla had initially remained at Clarence House, maintaining her innocence and preparing for what her lawyers described as a vigorous defense. However, as more evidence emerged and public opinion solidified against her, even her most loyal supporters began to distance themselves. The turning point had come when several former palace staff members came forward with testimony about the intimidation and threats they had experienced when trying to raise concerns about financial irregularities. Their accounts painted a picture of someone who had completely lost perspective on her role and responsibilities, believing that her position as queen consort placed her above normal standards of accountability. Public reaction to the unfolding scandal had been remarkably consistent. While there was some sympathy for Charles's personal situation, there was overwhelming support for his decision to prioritize institutional integrity over personal loyalty. Opinion polls showed that the majority of Britons believed the king was handling the crisis appropriately, with many commenting that they had gained new respect for his willingness to take difficult action. The international response had been equally supportive. Commonwealth leaders had privately expressed their appreciation for Charles's decisive handling of the situation, noting that his actions had actually strengthened rather than weakened the monarchy's reputation. The message was clear. Institutions that held themselves accountable were more trustworthy than those that protected their own, and had been Charles's closest advisor throughout the crisis, helping him navigate the complex legal, constitutional, and personal implications of his decisions. Her initial courage in bringing the evidence forward had been vindicated as more wrongdoing came to light, and she had emerged as a key figure in the monarchy's commitment to reform and transparency. "The lawyers are ready to file the divorce papers as soon as you give the word," and said as she joined Charles in his study that morning. "They've structured everything to ensure that the process moves as quickly and quietly as possible." Charles nodded sadly. The legal aspects of divorcing a queen consort were complex, involving not just personal considerations, but constitutional implications that required careful coordination with the government. The Prime Minister had been supportive throughout, understanding that the monarchy's long-term stability depended on decisive action. "How is William taking this?" Charles asked. His eldest son had been remarkably supportive publicly, but Charles knew the situation was causing stress throughout the entire family. "He understands why it's necessary," and replied. "He's actually proud of how you've handled it. He said it shows the kind of king you're going to be, someone who puts duty above personal comfort." This assessment would have meant more to Charles than any public approval rating. William's respect for his father's handling of the crisis suggested that the next generation understood the principles that would guide the monarchy's future. The formal announcement came that afternoon through a carefully crafted statement that was both personal and institutional in its tone. King Charles confirmed that he was seeking a divorce from Queen Consort Camilla, citing irreconcilable differences regarding fundamental questions of duty, integrity, and service to the crown. The statement continued, "Throughout my life, I have struggled to balance personal happiness with public duty. The events of recent weeks have made clear that when these two imperatives conflict, duty to the crown and the British people must always prevail. I deeply regret that my marriage has become a source of controversy rather than strength for the institution I serve." The announcement also included details about the financial restitution that would be made to affected charities. Charles had personally guaranteed that all misused funds would be returned with interest, and he established a new oversight mechanism to ensure such abuses could never occur again. The message was clear. The monarchy was taking full responsibility and implementing reforms to prevent future problems. Camilla's response was swift and bitter. Through her lawyers, she issued a statement claiming that she was being made a scapegoat for systemic problems within the royal household. She maintained her innocence of any intentional wrongdoing and suggested that she was being punished for administrative errors that any reasonable person would have corrected quietly. However, her position had become untenable. The weight of evidence against her was overwhelming, and her attempts to portray herself as a victim of palace intrigue had largely failed to convince the public. Even media outlets that had previously supported her were now calling for accountability and transparency. The divorce proceedings moved with unprecedented speed for a royal case. Constitutional lawyers worked around the clock to ensure that all legal and procedural requirements were met while minimizing the time the monarchy remained in crisis. Within 6 weeks, the marriage that had survived decades of public scrutiny was officially dissolved. As spring arrived, the immediate crisis had passed, but its implications continued to reshape the monarchy. Charles had emerged as a king willing to make difficult decisions based on principle rather than convenience. His approval ratings reached levels not seen since the early days of his accession, and public confidence in the monarchy had actually strengthened rather than weakened. The most significant long-term change was in how the royal family approached accountability and transparency. Charles established new oversight mechanisms for all royal finances, created an independent commission to review royal household operations, and instituted regular audits of charitable activities. The message to both the public and royal family members was clear. No one was above scrutiny. Anne's role in exposing the scandal had elevated her status both within the family and in public perception. She was increasingly seen as the embodiment of royal duty and integrity, someone willing to take personal risks to protect institutional values. Her influence on palace operations grew significantly, with many seeing her as a guarantor that such scandals would not recur. The broader royal family had to adjust to a new reality in which accountability was not just expected, but actively enforced. Younger royals, particularly William and Catherine, embraced the new standards enthusiastically, understanding that public trust was the foundation of their institution's continued relevance. For Charles personally, the transformation was profound. The king, who had spent decades struggling to balance personal desires with royal duty, had finally chosen duty unequivocally. The decision had cost him his marriage, but it had earned him the respect of his people and the confidence of his family. 6 months after the scandal broke, Charles reflected on the lessons learned during what palace insiders were already calling the integrity crisis. The monarchy had survived its greatest test in decades, not by covering up wrongdoing, but by confronting it directly. The institution was stronger because it had proven its willingness to hold itself to the highest standards. The empty space left by Camilla's departure was gradually filled by increased roles for other family members and a renewed focus on the monarchy's core mission of service. Charles found that his work was more fulfilling when it was untainted by personal controversy, and his relationship with the British people grew stronger as they saw him prioritize their interests over his own comfort. As he prepared for his first Christmas as a divorced king, Charles received a letter from his mother's former private secretary, now in his 90s, who had served the royal family for over 50 years. The letter praised Charles's handling of the crisis and included a line that brought tears to the king's eyes. "Your mother would have been proud of the courage you showed in putting the crown first." The scandal that had threatened to destroy Charles's reign had instead defined it in the most positive way possible. He had proven that the modern monarchy could be both accountable and enduring, that personal sacrifice in service of institutional integrity was not only possible, but necessary. The British people had watched their king face an impossible choice between love and duty, and they had seen him choose duty without hesitation. In doing so, Charles had finally earned the respect that had eluded him for much of his adult life. He was no longer the reluctant heir or the king in waiting. He was a monarch who had proven his worthiness through decisive action when it mattered most. As the years passed, historians would mark Charles's handling of the integrity crisis as the moment when the modern monarchy truly came of age. By choosing transparency over protection, accountability over convenience, and duty over personal happiness, King Charles III had secured not just his own legacy, but the future of the institution itself. The crown had indeed come first, and both the monarchy and the British people were stronger because of it. In losing his queen consort, Charles had found his true calling as a king who would never compromise the integrity of the institution he served. The price had been enormous, but the principle had been worth it.